You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hey, listeners. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Alan. Welcome to the very first episode of Alan's Record Bin. So you probably are familiar with my voice. You've heard it a million times on the Modern Musicology podcast, which we've been doing now for about 5 years. So, you've probably had a chance to get to know me a little bit. And let me just tell you a little bit about what I'm going to be doing with this show. This podcast is basically going to be like if I want to do some topics that don't necessarily fit in with the Modern Musicology schedule or are a little bit more personal to me or aren't things that really the other hosts would be terribly interested in. That's what I'm kind of doing with this like side project that I'm working on here. So I'm going to be doing some stuff from my pretty extensive record collection. I want to tell some stories behind some of the stuff that has ended up in my collection and why it's there. And as you probably know, I am very much a 70s and 80s classic rock kind of guy, but I have a very wide range of tastes. So upcoming episodes on this show could focus on rock or soul, classical, disco, electronica, prog, all kinds of things. So there's really no limit to what you might hear on this show. I might be doing an album deep dive or an artist deep dive. And I thought about even maybe doing like a concert rundown of some of the shows that I've seen in over my past few decades, particularly stadium shows that I saw back in the 80s. So this show is really going to be going back to the 80s, but not exclusively. There will be some 70s stuff, some 90s stuff, just whatever I feel like each time. And for this first show, I thought about doing a topic that I'm calling Forgotten AOR Songs. Now, AOR, of course, album-oriented rock. That's a radio format that really had its heyday in the mid-80s. And I have a real nostalgia for that time in my life because, like I just gotten my driver's license and gotten my first car and I'm riding around town with the windows down and I've got the radio cranked and it's blaring whatever our local rock radio station was at that time. I don't even remember what the call sign was, but it was out of Tampa, Florida. So I have a real, I look back on that time very, very fondly. It was one of those like times of life that you feel free and the music is so representative of where you are in life and what you're doing. And I just, love revisiting that era. So today's show, 5 Forgotten AOR Songs, we're going to kick it off with an artist that I know you're familiar with, and that's a guy called Brian Setzer. Now, I know you know him from the Stray Cats. The Stray Cats had really had a big moment in the early 80s with rockabilly, and their first 2 albums were only released in the UK. Stray Cats came out in 1981, and that had a couple of big singles on it, Rock This Town and Stray Cat Strut. And then their second album, Gonna Ball, both of those albums came out in 1981, and they were prepping for their first United States release. So they put together an album called Built for Speed, which took sort of the best tracks from each of those first 2 UK albums and combined it onto their debut US album. And that's where we hear things like Rock This Town and Stray Cat Strut and those songs that became big songs on US radio. In 1983, they put out their third album, technically second album in the US, but third overall, called Rant and Rave. That had Sexy and 17. That was a big hit for them. I Won't Stand in Your Way, which was a decent hit for them. And about that time, Setzer decided to end the Stray Cats. He had kind of gotten bored with what they were doing, which is insane because they hadn't really been doing it for that long. So each one of the cats went off and did their own thing. And Brian released his first solo album, and that came out in 1986. And that was called The Knife Feels Like Justice. And that is such a great title. So he really went for a big change of direction with this album. And it came out, like I said, in 1986. It had a very American roots rock kind of feel to it, very much in the vein of Mellencamp and Springsteen. And it really does capture that sound because he even used Mellencamp's producer, Don Gaiman, and Mellencamp's drummer, Kenny Aronoff, played on the album as well. It also has an all-star lineup of players on here, including Chuck Leavell from the Allman Brothers and later the Rolling Stones, and Ben Montench and Mike Campbell, who of course you know from Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. So let me play a little bit of this one. This is the title track, The Knife Feels Like Justice. This was the first single off the album. And I know that I saw it a handful of times on MTV, but I'm mostly familiar from the radio. So this is a little bit of the verse going into the first chorus. So here is The Knife Feels Like Justice. See if you remember this one.
Like the time you looked into the mirror and saw someone else looking back. I wish I could find the words, but there's nothing that even comes close. 'Cause there ain't nobody ever looked at me without looking right through me. There ain't nobody ever looked at me without looking right by me. And you can't go on when the knife feels like justice.
Man, I love that song. And when I was putting together this topic, Forgotten AOR Songs, that was the first thing that came to mind, because this was kind of a moment for Brian Setzer where he's moving away from what he's known for with the Stray Cats and moving into a very different direction musically. And it didn't really last very long. He went back to, of course, later in his career, he got very into the big band and the swing thing, and he did reunite with the Stray Cats, so they got back to their rockabilly thing. So this is kind of a one-off thing for him, and I think it kind of gets forgotten, especially by radio. You never hear this played, you never hear it talked about anymore. So I kind of wanted to go back to this and see, for my listeners, how many of you remember that song, and did you like it at that time? I loved it, and I was so excited. I never really got into the Stray Cats back in their heyday. I, of course, after that grew to have a huge appreciation for them. But at that time, it wasn't really where I was hitting. But this 1986 album, this solo album, really did. Like, I was very into this. And the album itself is a great album with some really strong tracks on it. So I wanted to highlight that first track and just kind of talk about AOR songs that have kind of been left behind. So the second one I thought I would talk about is from a lady called Fiona. Now, I know you're probably thinking Fiona Apple, but no, this is a girl called Fiona Flanagan who recorded under the name Fiona. And I don't really know that much about her. She never really hit big. And she's, so there's not a lot of information around about her. Her parents were from Dublin. They moved to the U.S. Fiona was born in Phillipsburg, New Jersey. And that's about it. That's pretty much all that I know about her background. She released her first album in 1985, a self-titled album. And this was at the time when, people like Pat Benatar were, heavy on the scene. And of course, Ann Wilson and a lot of other women with really big voices, even up to a band that was kind of happening at the time called Quarter Flash, whose lead singer, Randy Ross, man, she was great. And also the Motels with Martha Davis, great singer, great band. And so Fiona comes in right in the middle of this thing, but she's got a real rock voice. She's got a real gritty delivery. And I loved her first single was called Talk to Me. And it really jumped out at me. It was like the first time I heard it on the radio, grabbed me by the throat. And I was like, oh man, here is a new talent that I got to pay attention to. And sadly, she never really caught fire. It never really went anywhere for her, which is kind of sad. So let me play you this first single. This is Talk to Me, which was released in 1985 on Fiona's debut album, her self-titled album. So here we go.
I wanna feel some more. Now I wanna know, 'cause I've given it time. I'm not afraid of waiting if it has to be. Oh, baby, talk to me. How can I understand if you don't talk to me? And tell me what you're feeling. Talk to me. Just give it to me straight, baby, now before it gets too late. You got me anyway you want me.
There you go. Talk to Me by Fiona from 1985. Such a great song, and she has such a phenomenal voice. The following year, 1986, she released her second album, Beyond the Pale, which was a really solid album. I really enjoyed it. Led by two singles. The first one was Hopelessly Love You, which was fantastic. And then the second single was called Living in a Boy's World. Phenomenal song. Oh man, such a great, great, great tune. And unfortunately, neither one of these albums really did it for her. She had a third album, which had guest appearances by a couple of the guys from Winger. And in fact, Kip Winger sang a co-lead vocal in one of the songs with her. And she co-starred with Bob Dylan in the film Hearts of Fire. But other than that, she never really had much of a foothold in the industry, which is kind of a shame. And she kind of got out of the music industry for quite a while, and up until the early, I think, 2000s, where she came back and released a fourth and fifth album, which again didn't really do anything. So it's really sad. I thought she had a bright future, and it's too bad that she never really caught on. But that's one of the songs and one of the artists from that AOR period in the early mid 80s that I was really drawn to and really thought should have had a bigger success. It's kind of sad that she didn't. All right. So for song number 3, talk about Brian Setzer. Here is an artist that I know you're going to know, just like Brian, and that is Tommy Shaw from Styx. So kind of a similar story to Brian, other than the length of time here. Tommy joined Styx back in 76, I think it was. And the first album that he sang on was their 6th album called Crystal Ball. He wrote the title track. He wrote another song. It was a great album, and you can hear this band kind of forming around this new lineup because Tommy was a big influence on these guys and interjected a whole new songwriting voice and a new approach to the music. And it really shifted the whole personality of that band for the better, I would say. And not that they weren't good before that. They certainly were. If you go and check out their first 4 albums, which were released on an indie label called Wooden Nickel, I love those albums so much. So great stuff. He stayed with Styx for quite a while. They had a lot of successes. He had a lot of big hits with the band. And then comes 1983, where they released an album called Kilroy Was Here. And that was kind of the last straw for Tommy. So he had been getting a little bit more disillusioned with the band as Dennis DeYoung, who was kind of the founder of the band, really exerted more and more presence, I'll say, over the sound of the music and the direction of the music, and got a little more schmaltzy and a little more concept albumy, and in a way that Tommy really was finding a hard time fitting into. So 83 comes along and Kilroy Was Here, which was a concept album. And the breaking point for Tommy was the tour, because the tour was very, very different. They were at this point playing in stadiums, and they come out with this stage show, which is sort of formed around a play. And each one of them are in character, and there's dialogue, and there's it's just crazy. Props, staging, all this kind of stuff. So they're playing stadiums, and they've got opening bands that are just coming out like all guns firing. And then Styx comes on and does a drama. And man, Tommy was not feeling it. So after that tour, after Kilroy was here, after that tour in 1983, Tommy said, I'm out. See you guys. I'm done. The first thing that he did after leaving Styx was his first solo album, which was called Girls with Guns. And it's an intriguing title, but you'll hear, I'm going to play a little bit of that track for you. That was the first single that was released. And you'll hear this is kind of a poppy, sunny, kind of summery song, very up tempo, very kind of with a happy feel to it. And so this is the first thing that you hear from Tommy after he splits Styx. So here is that first single from that album, the title track from Girls with Guns.
I'll tell you now, and I won't tell you twice where, when, and how. I got some bad advice. I never thought I could handle a girl with guns. And let me tell you, you can bet that I'm not the only one. Now, stand tall, don't think small, don't put your back against the wall. Shoot straight, I can't wait, aim for the heart and fire away.
Man, that's such a good song. I love it. It's so fun. It's not really indicative of everything else that's on that album, though. That first album is really a solid record, and there's 3 standout tracks on it. The second track on the album, Come In and Explain, is really great. Another one called Outside in the Rain, solid. My favorite track on the album, though, is a song called Kiss Me Hello, which is kind of a mid-tempo, slow burn kind of thing. And on the original release of the album, it was about 5-ish minutes long. On the CD, on later reissues of the album, they put a full-length version, which is about quite almost 7.5 minutes. And it's so good. I would highly recommend listening to those tracks off of Girls with Guns. Now, Tommy did a few more solo albums after that. He kind of formed a band called Damn Yankees and had a lot of success with Damn Yankees and a couple of really fantastic singles that he wrote and sang lead on, and then eventually rejoined Styx. And now with Dennis DeYoung out of the band, Tommy's kind of the one who's driving the Styx bus. So he's kind of in control of the band. James Young, JY, one of the original Styx members, is still in the band. And so the two of them are kind of like in charge, but Tommy's really the creative leader of the band. And they've been doing some really, really phenomenal stuff lately. Go check out The Mission. It is my favorite, well, third favorite Styx album of their entire 50-ish year career. So go listen to it. It's super great. Okay, we're going to move into song number, 4. Song number 4 is from a band called Lone Justice. Now, Lone Justice was a band that was kind of coming around in the 80s and were kind of in that cowpunk sort of scene where they are definitely a rock band, but they have some country leanings and, a little bit more of an edge than some country bands that you would hear. And Maria McKee, their lead singer, a powerhouse. In fact, Dolly Parton once called her, quote, the greatest girl singer any band could ever have. Now that's an endorsement coming from Dolly Parton. You're an upcoming band, nobody knows who you are, and Dolly Parton says that about you. That's amazing. But Dolly is not the only music industry giant that's in Lone Justice's corner, because the band was introduced also to Linda Ronstadt. And Linda was so impressed with them that she just gets on the phone and calls up her good friend, David Geffen. I mean, how many people can just call David Geffen, right? And Linda says, look, there's this new band. You have got to hear them. You should sign them. And because of Linda, they get signed to Geffen Records for their first record deal. That's impressive. The album was produced by Jimmy Iovine, who you know from Petty and from Stevie and all these other places. The first single was a song called Ways to Be Wicked. And And on this first album, the band members are kind of doing a little bit of the songwriting. They're probably about half of the album is credited to either Maria or their bass player or, one of the other members, but mainly those two. But they do a few outside tracks also. And one of those is Ways to Be Wicked, which was written by Tom Petty and Mike Campbell. So that kind of tells you a little bit about what this song is going to sound like. But let me play it for you. This is a little bit, and check out Maria McKee's voice, man. She's a go-getter. So check this out. This is Ways to Be Wicked.
Well, I've been your fool before. Yeah, and I probably will again. 'Cause you ain't afraid to let me have it. No, you ain't afraid to stick it in. Well, oh, baby, ways to be wicked. Oh, but you don't know one little thing. La, la, la. Take a little pain.
All right, there you go. Ways to Be Wicked by Lone Justice, written by Tom Petty and Mike Campbell. On the strength of that single and their first record, they were sort of on an upward trajectory at this point. Unfortunately, they didn't really ever get big, kind of like Fiona, which is really a shame because they were such a phenomenal band. But on the strength of that first record, they booked a pretty big gig opening tour with U2. So they were very much positioned to be going somewhere, if you know what I mean. They released a second album the following year, which had, and I should say that it features a much more songwriting by the band. So they're not really doing as much outside material anymore. They're mainly sticking to stuff that they have written in-house. And that second album was called Shelter. And it was led by two singles, which were co-written by Maria McKee and Little Steven Van Zandt. How cool is that? And I think he actually produced the album also. And the first single was called I Found Love, which was just a fantastic, boot kicking kind of song. And then second single was a mid-tempo ballad it was the title track from the album called Shelter. And it's just an amazing song. I've got this friend named Rachel who we kind of trade songs every once in a while. We'll play music for each other and be like, hey, have you ever heard this? And she's very on top of things. She has a really wide musical taste and she's very aware of, lots of stuff that's going on. And she always introduces me to new things. And sometimes I struggle to find things that she's not ever heard of before. And one day it just occurred to me, what about Lone Justice? So I played her a couple of Lone Justice tracks and she said, how have I never known about this before? So I would highly recommend that you go back and listen to those, especially if you like this kind of sound, this sort of music. Go back and listen to those first couple albums by Lone Justice. They're phenomenal. All right. So once again, we are doing a show called 5 Forgotten AOR Songs. And these are all songs that got some airplay, and sometimes pretty big airplay back in the 80s on rock radio that never really caught on and have been sort of left behind and maybe forgotten. For our fifth song, when I say Forgotten AOR Songs, I mean that in this case, literally, I had absolutely forgotten about this song. Like it was not in my memory in any way at all. And this is a song called Last Chance by a band called Shooting Star. So let me tell you the story. I was in LA a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago. I don't remember. I was in LA and some friends and I were going to go out to eat. So we, called an Uber from our hotel. We're going to, go off to whatever restaurant we were going to. And, when you get an Uber, you're kind of at the mercy of whatever the driver likes to listen to. And a lot of times it's not necessarily in your wheelhouse, but you just and sometimes they will offer, hey, what station would you like me to put it on? And I always say, whatever you want to hear, because, they're the driver I don't want to impose my thing on the driver. You know what I mean? But in this case, it was a guy who was listening to a classic rock station. And I thought, oh, that's great. I can get into this. And whatever song was playing on the radio when we got in the car, we talked to the driver a little bit. The song goes off and then the next song starts. And it's kind of a quiet intro, and it's got a little violin, like a melody played on violin that comes in. And I think, this sounds so familiar. What is this? So it gets on, plays a little bit more, gets into that first verse. And I think, I know this. Why can't I recall what this is? But somehow I know I know this song. It gets into, like, throughout the first verse, and it hits this sort of big pre-chorus. And I think, holy shit, I know what this is. It's coming to me. It gets to that chorus, and I thought, holy cow, how could I possibly have forgotten this song? But it wasn't until later in the song, when it gets into a musical bridge, that I think, oh yeah, now I remember. Now I remember why I really loved this song. So let me tell you a little bit about Shooting Star. They are from the Midwest, and they sort of have a very similar Kansas sound to them. They have, like, kind of that era of Kansas around 1980, when the Audio Visions album came out, and then the follow-up, Vinyl Confessions, which came out in 1982, sort of has that sort of sound. They are like Kansas. They're from the Midwest. And in fact, they are from Kansas City, Missouri. So they're right next door to where Kansas grew up. Like Kansas, they have a violin player. In Kansas, you have Robbie Steinhardt, who was one of the great rock fiddle players, just amazing guy. Like Kansas, Shooting Star has 2 lead singers. And in the clip I'm going to play for you, you can hear them singing different parts of the song. The verse is by one guy. The pre-chorus is by the other guy. And then the band comes in on the full chorus. So let me go ahead and play that for you a little bit. This is end of the first verse going into the pre-chorus, and then the chorus. And this is Shooting Star doing Last Chance.
And the stranger said to them, I have been upon the mountain. I have witnessed forces like cannons that can ram you to the ground. Stand up on your feet. Your life is shoulders down. You could be dead tomorrow. Today may be your last chance to believe in yourself. Your last chance, yeah. Your last chance to be good to yourself. Your last chance to drink from life's well.
So there you go. That is Last Chance by Shooting Star. And I think you can kind of hear that Kansas influence on that band in that clip right there, especially that violin, which sounds so Robbie Steinhardt, the way that it comes in and the melody, the counter melody that's playing there. And like I said, this really reminds me of 1980, 82 Kansas Audio Visions and Vinyl Confessions. But according to Wikipedia, the Shooting Star album came out in 1979. So it predates those 2 albums. Now, I don't think that Kansas, was ripping off Shooting Star or was influenced by them in any way. I think that Kansas's musical progression was a very natural one. It's just a weird coincidence, I think, that both of these bands are kind of operating in the same mode. You know what I mean? So I heard that song a few times. Here's the thing. I don't remember hearing it as early as 79. It seems to me, in my, probably wonky memory, that it was later on, like 83, 84-ish. I don't know. And that's probably why I think in my faulty memory that Shooting Star sounds like that period of Kansas, because in my head it came after, but apparently it did not. So on the strength of that song, which I really loved, I went out and bought the album, and the rest of the album did not really live up to that song. And I played it a few times and kind of set it aside. The song went, out of favor on the radio. It kind of moved past. It didn't have a long shelf life or anything. And after a while, I just forgot about it until that Uber ride in LA just a couple of years ago, when it just randomly came on the radio. And I was like, holy shit, how have I forgotten about that song? It's crazy. And like I said, it wasn't necessarily just the verse and the chorus that really stood out to me. It was when the song gets into that instrumental section. So I'm going to play a little bit of that for you too, because I want you to hear kind of the Kansas influence on here as well. So this is the middle section of Last Chance. Oh yeah, I love that. And that instrumental break goes on for a good bit longer. It's not just that part. It goes on beyond that. And then there's a big drum break in there. And the drummer even uses a timpani in that. And, you know, if you listen to Modern Musicology enough, you know I'm a drummer. So any song that's going to have a big drum solo in it, I'm all into. And especially if they're going to do something other than, you know, your typical drum set where he's just like wailing away on a timpani, which I think is just the coolest thing. So, and in that section right there, you can kind of hear that Kansas sound. And this sounds like very like classic Kansas with that Rich Williams guitar sound, and the Steve Walsh Hammond organ is so good. And the rest of that song just moves on, and it's just kind of got this epic nature to it. It's about 7 minutes long. And it boggles my mind that I had forgotten about that song over the years. Like it just, you know, went out of my brain, which is just crazy. But anyway, that's the 5 forgotten AOR songs that when I decided to do this topic, that was the first 5 things that I thought of. And I loved revisiting these songs and kind of sharing a little bit about them with you. So I want you to tell me what some of your favorite AOR songs, or any radio format songs that maybe have fallen off the radar. Maybe they're not thought of anymore. Maybe the radio never plays them anymore, but they were, you know, got either they were big at the time or got some radio airplay at the time. What are some of your memories of that time? So I hope that listening to this show, if you are, you know, from that 80s AOR period, I hope that some of these songs brought back some good memories for you. And if there's some things here that you hadn't heard before, I hope that you are inspired to go and look up some of these albums and listen to some of these songs in full. I think you'll really enjoy them. And that's our first show. So I just want to say thank you so much for listening this far. I really appreciate it. Let me know what you think. You can drop me a line. Now you can just use the Modern Musicology email address, modernmusicology1@gmail.com. Or I'll be posting this on our socials, so you can just comment there if you like. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back in probably a month or so with another episode. And if you have any topics that you want me to explore, or that you want Modern Musicology to explore, just let us know. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you soon.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping for the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.